Well, thank you very much, Professor Han, for a kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I found just a little bit more of professors and staff when I was asked to give a lecture. I thought I would give a lecture to students, but I just find that very many professors and staff. Anyway, I'm very pleased to meet you. What I plan to do today is to give you a little talk about Korean economic development experiences of the past, with a particular focus on how Korea was able to achieve such a remarkable economic success during the past half a century. I plan to speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then I will take questions from the floor and entertain some of the comments, whatever you have. So be prepared to raise questions. Let me begin by quoting a couple, one from the speech done by President Obama of the States, and the other is a quote which I got from a book titled Why Nations Fail. The first is the quote from President Obama. President Obama, when he gave a speech at Ghana of Africa, what he said was, countries like Kenya, which had a per capita income larger than South Korea's when he was born, have been badly outpaced. What this means is that in the early 1960s, per capita income of not only of Kenya, but several of African countries were higher than that of Korea. The second citation is from the book titled Why Nations Fail. The people of South Korea have living standards similar to those of Portugal and Spain to the north. North Korea living standards are akin to those of sub-Saharan African country, about 1/10 of average living standards in South Korea. This colored in red is emphasized by me, not by the author. What he said is, neither culture nor geography nor ignorance can explain the divergent pathways of North and South Korea. The authors are Darren Acemoglu, he's a professor at MIT, and James Robinson, he's a professor at Harvard. It's quite a long book describing how and why the growth pathways of several nations in the world have diverged during the past few centuries. They actually spent quite a bit in their book describing how Korea was able to achieve such rapid economic growth. Their answer to such questions is that institution mattered. Korea, as you all know, Korea had been a very poor country for a very long period of time. It's not a matter of decades, it's just a matter of centuries. For several centuries, Korea had been a very poor country, but Korea emerged from such a poor country to a high-income country with a very short period of time. And the question is, why? Why did the same Korean people live under such poor living conditions for such a long period of time? The answer is that for the case of Korean people of the earlier period, they lived under relatively very poorly performing institutions. So what they argued was the institution method. And the difference between North and South Korea, as you know, they are the same people. And as it was written here, they have the same culture, they have the same geography, and the intellectual capacity-wise, probably more or less the same. But North is per capita income. According to the authors, is 1/10. Actually, it's 1/20 of South Korea. And why such differences happen, basically, is due to the different institutions. And this is the argument of the authors of the book. So just keep these two sides in your mind. One is that one is done by President Obama. The other is the quotation from the book. This is a very simple graph which showed how dramatically Korea's industrialization took place during the past half a century. During the early 1960s, Korea didn't have much to export, and wheat was the primary product that we were able to export. And then in the 60s, we began exporting textile, apparel, and other products. And then, as you saw from this graph, that recently more than nearly 80% of our products are heavy and chemical industry products, namely relatively advanced technology products. And only 14% are from light industry product and 6% from primary product. Just keep also this in your head. The second graph, this is quite a dramatic, you find quite a dramatic decline in the illiteracy rate of Korean. Some of you, particularly if there are foreigners here, some of you already know that Koreans have had very high aspirations for education. For the moment, more than 70 or nearly 80% of high school graduates are entering colleges. And, but some of you may be surprised to find this. When Korea was liberated from Japan, Korea had been under Japanese colony for some time. In 1945, Korea was liberated, and at that time, nearly 80% of the people were not able to read. The illiteracy rate was nearly 80% in 1945. Some of you might have voted yesterday, and when Korean government was established in 1948, the first voting took place, and at that time, nearly 60% of people were not able to read. So they couldn't read the names of the candidates. So the way they voted was that at the time, let's say, at least they were able to count the number of sticks. So rather than giving the name on the ballot of the voting, what was given was the number of sticks. 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks, like that. And that was the way how voting took place 60 years ago. And the illiteracy rate declined from 78 to quite rapidly to 15% in the mid-1960s. I entered college in mid-1960s. When I entered, only 12% of boys and 4% of girls entered college. At the time, 15% of Korean nationals were illiterate. This is quite surprising information to some of you. Okay, and so with the two quotations and then two graphs, one which showed a very rapid industrialization process, the second, educational attainment, the importance of educational attainment, and with these four in mind, let us move on to the next graphs, actually next to the pictures. I will show you some snapshots of Korean society. One good picture is worth 1,000 words. The first one is the comparison of Gangnam area between 1950s and 2010. So 60 years apart. On the left side is the area of Gangnam, as you know, this is the most prosperous area in Seoul these days. But 60 years ago, it was like that. But now, on the right side, you see how developed Gangnam area recently. The second one is Cheonggyecheon. Cheonggyecheon is a little stream in the downtown and Seoul area. On the left side, the Cheonggyecheon circa 1950s, and 60 years later, you saw how developed the Cheonggyecheon became. The third one is the comparison of factories. The left side is a typical apparel factory, circa 1960s, and 50 years later, you saw very modern, industrialized, advanced factory. This is a picture of a semiconductor industry company, and you saw how different the two are. The first few pictures are about economic progress, but the last one is about the political progress. We say that during the 60s and 70s, Korean economy had been industrialized, but from mid-1980s, Korean society became democratized. So industrialization and democratization took place sequentially, one from the 60s to 80s, and from mid-80s to until now, democratization took place. And I guess probably from now on, the keyword that we hope to pursue is probably advancement, and to make Korea an advanced economy is one of the key missions that we currently have. But in the past, we achieved both industrialization and democratization at the same time during 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, and this one is this really compares the two different scenes after Korea began experiencing a financial crisis. As you know, in the late 1990s, not only Korea, but also many Asian countries experienced financial crisis, Asian crisis. And on the right side, since 2008, many, if not all, or many of the countries in the world experienced a global financial crisis. Of course, Korea was hit by crisis for both times, but the difference is that for the case of 1997 crisis, in Korea, we call it the IMF crisis rather than a Korean crisis, because we want to characterize that as a crisis which, to some, rightly or wrongly, perceived that it was sort of forced by the IMF. And I don't think it was right, but anyway, in Korea, we call it the IMF crisis. And the IMF people are very much upset to hear that. We call it the IMF crisis. But for the case of all other crises, I guess there have been more than 200 crises since 1970s. But all those crises were named after their country. The crisis that took place in Mexico is called Mexican crisis, and the crisis that took place in Greece is called Greek crisis. But for the case of Korea, we don't call it a Korean crisis. We call it the IMF crisis. But in any event, for the case of 1997 crisis, the crisis looked quite different from the other one, in that we were seriously hit by the crisis, and the upper panel of the left-hand side, you can see a huge number of people who became unemployed after the crisis. But for the case of 2008 crisis, of course, we were hit by the crisis, but we didn't experience such a rapid rise in unemployment rate at the time. And by the way, I don't want to spend much time elaborating the differences in two different crises this time, because this is a topic that I will deal with at my another Odyssey lecture, which may take place in a few weeks. And at the time, I will focus on economic crisis and therefore I will not elaborate this time the causes and consequences of these two crises. Let me show you some numbers. From the top, you can see that per capita income of Korea was extremely low, and in early 1960s, it was merely $82. Believe it or not, Korea was one of the poorest countries in Asia. At the time, name any country in Asia, their per capita income was higher than that of Korea, except for one. I don't want to name that country because that country's per capita income is still very low, but Korea's per capita income was second lowest at the time. And but now per capita income of Korea amounted to 27,000, and it was a little higher in 2014, but it decreased, partly due to the rise in the foreign exchange rate and so forth. But anyway, it's now 27,000 in US dollars. You may not understand how rapidly Korea's per capita income increased during the past 50 years. Let me give you different numbers. When we compare the per capita income of different countries, we usually compare per capita in PPP, purchasing power parity. For the case of the per capita income between USA and Korea, in early 1960s, Korea's per capita income in purchasing power parity was about 12% of that of the United States. Now it's 62%. So what that means is that, relatively speaking, Korea's per capita income rose 5 times faster than that of the United States. And during the past 50 years, in PPP terms, U.S. per capita income increased by 10 times, whereas Korea's per capita income increased by 50 times. So in that respect, Korea's per capita income increased 5 times faster than that of the United States. Korea joined the OECD in 1996. I assume that all of you are aware what the OECD stands for. This is the organization we usually call representing a club of rich countries. And Korea joined the OECD in 1964. So since then on, Korea hoped to transform the economy to be ranked as an advanced economy. And Korea joined the OECD's Development Assistance Committee in 2010. And the title of today's lecture is moving from an aid recipient country to a donor country. And we became a donor country by joining the Development Assistance Committee in 2010. And Korea was the first in the history of the world, the first country that changed from a formerly aid recipient to a donor country. There are more than 200 countries in the world, and except for, let's say, about 20 advanced economies, they were once classified as aid recipient countries, and they have received aid from foreign countries. And Korea was the first ever country that turned from a formerly aid recipient to a donor country. Some of you may wonder, well, these days China gave a huge amount of foreign aid to some African countries, and why China cannot be, let's say, classified as a donor country, even if it gave much foreign aid. But no, such a country cannot be classified as a donor by simply providing foreign aid to other countries. To be classified as a donor country, you have to be graduated from, let's say, a category of aid-receiving country. So for the case of China and many other countries, of course, on the one hand, they provide foreign aid to other countries, but at the same time, they have still continuously received certain type of aids, for example, including from the World Bank and others. For the case of Korea, we have graduated from receiving foreign aid and others from the World Bank some years ago. That is why we were able to join the advanced country status. But for other countries, even if they provide foreign aid to certain countries, they cannot be counted as donor countries. So in that respect, Korea was the first ever in the history of the world that turned from formerly aid recipient to a donor country. The fourth one is that you know that in the process of overcoming the global financial crisis since 2008, the G20 had played a very crucial role. And Korea hosted G20 as the first non-G7 country. So in 2010, Korea played a very important role in, let's say, in harmonizing the different policy stances between advanced and emerging economies. And Korea hosted that in 2010. On a personal note, I have a little, let's say, relationship with the last three. When Korea joined the OECD, I served as a chief negotiator. And when Korea joined the OECD Development Assistance Committee, I served as a Korean ambassador to the OECD. And when Korea hosted G20 summit, of course, there is a summit meeting, but under the summit meeting, by we, I mean central bank governors and finance ministers met several times. And Korea served as a co-chairman of the finance minister and central bank governors meeting. I was one of the co-chairmen of the G20 summit. So for the last, I didn't choose because of my personal relationship with the three, but those were very important occasions for Korea's development of the past. But what I say is that on a personal note, I have had a certain relationship with the three developments. Okay, what this graph shows is that even if Korea has achieved remarkable progress during the past half a century, there were certain times that Korea faced difficulties. Particularly, there were three periods. I marked two because those two represent the periods of crisis. But there was another one in the late 1970s. That was the period what we call the oil shock crisis. Actually, the first oil shock crisis took place in early 1970s, 1973. And but we were hit harder during the second oil crisis, which took place in late 1970s. And so 1970s was the first time in Korean history that Korean economic growth rate turned out to be negative. And then during the past two financial crises in late 1990s, and then 2008, we also experienced negative economic growth. But what I'd like to emphasize is that, of course, when crisis took place, our economic growth rate turned out to be negative, but Korea was quicker than any country in the world in recovering from the crisis. In overcoming the crisis, of course, we have done many efforts by introducing very important policies and institutional changes. But what this graph shows is that the line in red shows after the 2008 global financial crisis, how Korea quickly recovered from the crisis. And for the case of line in blue, which showed how we overcame the 1997 crisis. The recession was deeper, but it was also steeper in recovering from the crisis. And you can actually compare these several lines. This one represents a Korean recovery path, and the other three represent recovery paths of other countries. This one is recovery path of the OECD average, and this one is European Union, the other is United States. But you see that quite noticeably Korean growth path turned out to be different from others. We recovered much quicker than those of other countries. Now, with such a short introductory remarks, let us review how Korea made efforts in achieving economic growth. The first one, I divided the whole period into 3 or 4 different periods. The first one is the period representing after Korean liberation from Japanese colony. When Korea was liberated after World War II in 1945, Korean industrial structure was quite primitive, and we didn't have much industrial sectors. And furthermore, the production was very low, and therefore what we faced was a very high hyperinflation. You see from this line here, we experienced 390% of inflation at the time. So the first priority of the policy was placed on curbing the high inflation. And then, of course, post-war reconstruction of the economy received much public attention. And at that time, I will use this term, import substitution, at the same time, export promotion a few times during my lecture. But like any other emerging economies, in the beginning, of course, we focused on the policies named import substitution. Some of you who do not major in economics may not be familiar with such expressions or such, let's say, it's just like, let me explain a different way. When the economy is in poor shape, right? You don't have much industries, and what that means is that you don't have much to produce. But you have to, in order to maintain your living standard, what you have to do is that you have to import from other countries. But these poor countries are usually endowed with, or usually these countries usually have certain, let's say, policy restrictions, in that they are in short of foreign reserves. So they cannot, let's say, purchase foreign imports. And so usually the focus is placed upon rearing import substitution industries. For example, when the country is very poor, this is the case for many emerging economies and formerly, let's say, transition economies. When what the society or economy faces that they lack consumption goods. So when China actually entered the international market in the late 1980s and early 1990s, also the same was the formerly Soviet Union, what they focused was to, let's say, to construct the consumption goods, let's say, industries. They lack toothpaste, they lack soap, they lack those kind of consumer goods. And so what the country usually did for most emerging economies, they focused on rearing these consumer-oriented industries. And so this is the way to replace imported goods and with their own produced domestic goods. And the same was true for Korea. So we focused on rearing import substitution industries. As I said, this is more or less the same for many emerging economies. And at the time, foreign aid, particularly the foreign aid from the United States, constituted a very large part of Korean budget. And so our growth rate depended very much upon the amount of foreign aid that we received from the United States and other countries. And with that, so for the case of, let's say, the period of 1950s, we actually grew on average by less than 4%. But the problem was that after, let's say, late 1950s, for example, the United States began reducing the amount of foreign aid to other countries, because some of you may be familiar with the name of a Marshall Plan, which is the plan to let's say, help the then war-torn economies of European countries. And so the United States provided huge amount of foreign aid to European countries. And so European countries used those foreign aid from the United States to rehabilitate from the then war-torn European countries. And so U.S. began feeling some type of some pressures from their own side. So they were not able to afford to provide any further foreign aid to other countries. So as I said, in the 1950s, we depended very heavily upon foreign aid from the United States, but the United States decided to reduce the amount of foreign aid given to other countries. And so as the size of foreign aid began decreasing, what our government found was that our government was not able to maintain even that type of, that level of economic growth since the late 1950s. So Korean government changed the policy strategy, and so they switched from import substitution policy to export-driven or export promotion policy from then on. It was quite an important turning point, and why Korea did it. As I said, the amount of foreign aid was decreased, and furthermore, as you know, Korea is not endowed with natural resources. So unlike some other emerging economies in Asia and other countries, we were not able, we didn't have any to use for export. So Korea was not able to export materials like oil or other resources, and the amount of foreign aid began decreasing. So we changed our policy stance from import substitution policy, rearing import substitution industries, to fostering export promotion policies. So it was a very important turning point as far as our policy stance was concerned. So since then on, Korean government began establishing a 5-year economic development plan. So 1962 was the first year that Korea government initiated the first 5-year economic development plan. Actually, we had in total 6 5-year plans. So it started from 1962, and it ended in early 1990s. It ended in 1992. And this served as a catalyst for Korean economic development. But at that time, it was a government-led economic plan. And actually, I don't know whether there are any students from emerging economies, and some emerging economies these days try to learn some development experiences of Korea of the past. One thing, what is important is that when you let's say, establish a 5-year economic development plan, what you have to do is that you have to understand how growth plan should be established. At the time, in early 1960s, to be very frank with you, Korean government or Korean society did not have a sufficient number of, let's say, professionals who knew how to establish 5 economic development plan. So what we did, we depended very heavily upon the advices of foreign scholars. So Korean government actually invited many very prominent scholars from the United States and European countries, and these people helped Korean government establish 5 economic development plan. So during the first 5 economic development plan, virtually there was no Korean who was involved in establishing such a plan. From the second one, which started from 1967, a few Koreans actually participated in making the plan. But from the third one, which started from 1971, the whole plan was made by Korean professionals and government officials. And time really flies, passes very quickly. And as I said, I will speak for about 50 minutes. I have only probably 10 or 15 more minutes, so I don't know whether I can speak faster, but I will do my best. And then, so in the 60s and 70s, focus was placed on industrializing the whole economy. But you know that whenever something good happens, always something bad follows. And so in the 60s and 70s, Korea government focused on economic growth by doing everything in the capacity of the society. But what it found was that certain type of negative or side effects actually happened. The first one is that the inflation rate turned out to be extremely high. And in late 1970s, CPI, Consumer Price Index, rose to 29%. PPI stands for Producers Price Index. It rose to nearly 40%. And so fiscal deficit increased very rapidly, and it amounted even to 4.5% in 1981. So in early 1980s, in 1984 specifically, Korean government budget was frozen. It was totally unthinkable to freeze government budget, even during the time where inflation rate was so high. These days, freezing a budget does not cause much pain because the inflation rate is very low. But when inflation rate is very high, freezing the budget creates a lot of pains to many sectors of the society. But Korea was able to do it, and at the same time, Korean development plan changed from government-led authoritative type of economic growth to an indicative type economic growth. Indicative planning is different from authoritative economic planning in many ways, but the most important one is that for the case of indicative planning, as the planning is done by the participation of all agents of the society, and so the consequence is that all those agents began feeling that those plans are likely to be fulfilled. Why? They were all involved in establishing the plan. So this is what we call self-fulfilling prophecy of the indicative planning. So this is the merit of that. So we moved from authoritative government-led development planning to indicative planning in the 80s. And then at the same time, stabilization rather than growth attracted much public attention, and liberalization or deregulation rather than regulation attracted much public attention. And then with such policy and policies and institutional changes, what we ended up with a remarkable turnaround from 29% of inflation to merely 2% inflation with a very short period of time, with a span of 3 or 4 years. It was really remarkable. And at the same time, fiscal deficit actually ended, and then we began experiencing fiscal surplus from 1987. And at the same time, current account balance changed from deficit to surplus from 1986. In 1985, I was involved in one of the task forces to study Korean foreign debt problem. Many of you are young, so you may not be aware how much Korea was indebted. At that time, Korea was fourth largest heavily indebted country in the world. By that, the amount of government debt, particularly foreign debt, was very high. We say that Korea was fourth highest after MBA. MBA stands for Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And so all Korean government efforts were placed on finding ways to reduce the total amount of foreign deficits. And the amount of foreign reserves was really minimal. And these days, Korea has a relatively large amount of foreign aid amounting to nearly $360 billion. But at the time, it was really minimal. And so, but from 1986 and on, quite a remarkable changes were made, and it is primarily due to the changing environment of the global economy. But I will not I will elaborate those any further. And okay, but as I said, even if Korea achieved very rapid economic growth in 60s and 70s, and even if Korea changed the policy stance rather dramatically from growth enhancing to maintaining stability, still a lot of side effects actually began taking place. What those side effects are? The death of the corporations. Corporate debt began increasing from late 70s, and then it reached it passed a certain level of a threshold, and so Korean corporations were heavily indebted, and that became one of the critical causes of the 1997 financial crisis. So even if Korea achieved remarkable economic successes during 60s, 70s, but certain type of, let's say, problems actually have been, let's say, accumulated inside of the Korean economy. And so Korea began experiencing financial crisis in late 1990s. As I said, I will elaborate all these issues later in my different lecture. So I will skip this. And then this is the highlight, actually, summary of my lecture. Some of you, as I said, may wonder, then what are the crucial factors that made a Korean economy grow so rapidly? And I guess scholars may opt to choose very many different factors, but I'd like to highlight these three. I personally think these three are really crucial, critical factors that made Korean economy grow that fast. The first one is outward-looking development strategy. I cannot emphasize the importance of this, but the point I'd like to make is that it is not easy for emerging economies to take this as a main strategy of economic growth. But you always have to take outward-looking development strategy in order to prosper, to grow. For many emerging economies, the reason that they were not able to take this outward-looking development strategy is because their economies were endowed with many natural resources. So they always wanted to protect their own resources from foreign, let's say, foreign dominance. So that is why they became very much protective of their own industries. But for the case of Korea, as I said, Korea was not endowed with any natural resources, so we didn't have many to protect. So to that extent, we were able to move to this outward-looking development strategy relatively easily. But anyway, it was not an easy decision. But we were fortunate enough to have this export promotion or outward-looking development strategy. And it resulted in a very high economic growth. And with the benefit of open economy, what are they? First one is that you can utilize efficiently the changes in external environment. And another point is that unless you open your economy, it's not easy for you to maintain global competitiveness. So global competition is extremely important to enhance the domestic competitiveness. And the third one is that by opening up the economy, you can utilize the economies of scale. The fourth one is from my own observation. For the case of many emerging economies, the problem is that the economies are corrupt. And the corruption is a very serious problem for many emerging economies. And how to eradicate, how to avoid making the society and economy from being corrupt, the best solution, the best alternative is to open the market. So if you let foreigners compete in your society and economy tends to be more transparent. And so I think opening up the market is crucial to prevent corruption. And of course, I'm not saying that it is not without risk. Of course, there is always risk. You know that North Korea has never experienced financial crisis. Why? The whole economies are closed. So they don't have to worry about the contagion. And economic crisis can be contagious, but the economies are completely closed. And so they don't have to worry about the contagion risk. The same is true for many formerly socialist countries. The countries were closed, so they were free from being contagious. And so there is always such a risk, but you have to overcome such risks with your own, let's say, policies and efforts, rather than protecting your markets by closing the markets. It needs a very long explanation, but let me just quote what Charles Darwin said. What Charles Darwin said was, "It is neither the strongest nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that adapts to changes." The same is true for Korea. Don't ever assume that Korean government officials and professionals were wise enough to take always the best alternatives for the economy. That is not necessarily true. We have made many mistakes in the past. But the difference between Korea of the time and other countries is that whenever Korean government found that there was something wrong, or whenever Korean government found that there was a better alternative, we were very quick to move in that direction. These are the examples. We moved from import substitution to export promotion, And we moved from rearing light manufacturing industry to fostering heavy and chemical industry and so forth. So we changed our policy stances rather dramatically during the past few decades. And what that means is that don't ever assume that we always chose right policies or good policies. There were sometimes our decisions were not necessarily good, but we were very quick enough to change our policy stances at that time. This third one is the emphasis on market principle. Here, the will to economize, I don't know whether you are familiar with this expression. This is the term used by Professor Arthur Lewis. He received the Nobel Prize in 1979 by his seminal book on a theory on economic growth. And there he used this term. Will to economize is extremely important for economic growth. For students, will to study is important, right? If you don't have a will to study, you don't expect that you can outperform your classmates and your friends. So will to economize or will to study, will is extremely important. And so for the case of Korea, there are several sources for having or making Korean people having a strong will to economize. Okay, finally, let me say a few words on G20 Korea initiatives. As I said, Korea hosted G20 summit in 2010. Some of you who have quick eyes may recognize this gentleman. This madam, she is Christine Lagarde. She is managing director of the IMF for the moment. But she, in 2010, she was a finance minister of France. And I was, as I said, co-chairman of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. So she sat beside me for 2 years. For 1 year on my right side, the next year on my left side, because France hosted G20 summit in 2011. And as an ex-official, I said, Korea sat beside France, so she sat beside me. So we sat together for 2 years, and we met many times. And here at the G20 in 2010, as Korea initiatives, it was not the only one. There were two more. Probably there was one more important Korean initiative, but I don't want to elaborate that any further here. But I'd like to introduce to you this development issue. In 2010, when that was in the midst of a global financial crisis. And of course, United States, Japan, and European countries faced a very serious financial crisis. But at the same time, the developing economies, or at least the developed economies, faced much more severe recessions. Why? Because these advanced economies didn't grow. Actually, these very poor countries didn't receive much support from these advanced economies. So what we proposed was that we should find certain ways to help these less developed countries, not only to overcome the financial crisis, but also to achieve sustainable economic growth. And there, the argument is that up until that time, most emerging economies and poor countries always wanted to receive relatively large amount of foreign aid for economic growth. But from Korean experiences, we say, of course, money matters. Money is important, but what matters more is knowledge and experience. So what we introduced was here KSP program, knowledge sharing program, by offering emerging economies that we were willing to share our development experiences with emerging economies. And I was one of the first advocates of this knowledge sharing program. Actually, the knowledge sharing program in Korea was initiated, I shouldn't say it was solely by me, but it was done when I was head of the institution named Korea Development Institute. And this knowledge sharing program was introduced in 2004. At the time, I was the president of that institution. And it was, of course, done by the advices and suggestions by many professionals. But anyway, I was the person who was in charge of introducing this program to Korea. What this knowledge sharing program focuses or emphasizes is that knowledge, experience matter as equally as money. So money matters, but money is not all. Don't ever assume that many currently least developed countries were not able to get out of poverty due to the lack of money. Yes, of course, money matters, but money is not the everything. And furthermore, the point is that Korea's success is proven, and therefore, Korea suggested that we were much willing to offer our experiences, and we were willing to share our experiences with other countries. So this was a very important proposal at the time, and it was received very well by the leaders of other G20 countries. So it was adopted as an important global agenda, and still all those G20 countries have continuously endeavored to find ways to let's say to further strengthen this program. Well, I have spent probably more than 50 minutes, so I better stop there. And as I said in the beginning, I'll be more than happy to entertain or take questions from you. Yes.
안녕하세요. 연구전팀에서 근무하는 이상이라고 합니다. President, thank you for your wonderful and enriching lecture on the secrets of Korea's economic development. Well, to my knowledge, some scholars argue that Japanese rule of Korea had laid the foundation for future economic development. Do you think that economic development taking place under the Japanese rule brought much benefit to the Korea's future economic development? And how do you think we can understand better the relationship between the Japanese colonialism and Korea's economic development in 1970s? So some people say it is reasonable to say that Korea grew on the shoulders of colonial achievement rather than emerging out of the ashes left by the Korean War. What do you think?
Okay, what a good question. I guess I should have said this in the beginning. I used to make a rule to take only easy questions, but since I didn't do it in the beginning, I guess I'm obliged to take your question. Of course, as I said, this is not an easy question to answer in a simple way. Of course, I know that there are some group of people, particularly who have some favorable views on Japan, in many respects, say that there was certain positive contribution by Japanese rule on Korean modernization. But to be very honest with you, as I said, modernization or economic growth cannot be achieved by the forces of other countries. As I said, foreign aid matters, money matters, but what matters more is the endogenous or the endogenous, let's say, motivation for economic growth. So you cannot grow with the help of others. And Japan, of course, Japanese may argue that during the colonial period, Korea's modernization took place. Maybe true, but at the same time, Japan exploited for much resources from Korea, and which made Korea poorer and others. And therefore, I guess on balance, Korea was let's say, I don't know whether disadvantaged is the right word, or I don't know whether Korea was penalized was the right word, or deprivated was the right word. But anyway, I guess the overall assessment is that the impact of Japanese role on Korea's modernization and development was I think negative. But this is the issue of the past, so I don't want to spend too much time elaborating these issues, but I don't necessarily agree with such an argument that Japanese colonial time contributed to modernizing Korean, let's say, industry and others. But as I said, what I like to emphasize is that for any country to prosper or to achieve economic growth, the motivation or the initiative must come from their own country. You cannot grow with the help of outsiders. The same is true for students who study. You cannot do better. Of course, you can do better with the help of others, but in order to succeed, basically, it's up to you, not up to others, to tutors and others. But from now on, I'll take only easy questions. You can ask from the back side. Oh, yes.
Hello, thank you for that. So, of course, we just had elections yesterday, right? And I think, or from what I understand about the Korean elections yesterday, was that a lot of seats were lost by the ruling party, mostly for economic reasons, right? So you said that the future of Korea, or what Korea is attempting to achieve from now on, is economic stability, right? So stabilizing the country, stabilizing the economy. And economic stability basically means no more rapid growth. Like the type of growth that Korea saw, it's completely unsustainable for that long, like into the future, right? So stability basically means, okay, we have what we have now. It's going to essentially stabilize so we don't lose anything, but we also can't see rapid gains like that again. And I guess my question is, the ruling party lost seats because the economy, people still see the economy as the most important thing, right? So what exactly does stability mean? Once we have economic stability, does that mean that the people are going to start focusing more on democracy in Korea or life in Korea? Or is it still, do you think, going to be focused only on economy into the near future?
Did I say that I take only easy questions?
Sorry.
All right, okay, good. Good question, Joshua. Yes, Korea. Well, as I said, it's quite difficult to answer your question. But I didn't say that stability receives in the future the most attention. What I said was economic advancement will receive the most attention from now on. And the point is, in the past, we tried to achieve higher growth. What that means is that we try to expand the size of the economy, so we focused on achieving our quantitative target. But from now on, what matters is the qualitative nature of the economic growth. So the percentage, of course, matters. Of course, people would like to have relatively high economic growth, but most people know that the whole environment is not such favorable for us to achieve relatively high economic growth. But what people want is high quality economic growth. What that means is that the difference is that for the case of high economic growth, quantitatively, is the way we achieved economic growth in the past by putting more inputs for economic growth, including labor, capital, and technology advancement, and so forth. But from now on, what matters is achieving economic growth, not by increasing our inputs for production, but by enhancing our productivity or efficiency. And I don't think we can achieve higher economic growth by increasing only our productivity in economic terms, total factor productivity. So increasing total factor productivity is a very important critical question, but you cannot achieve very high economic growth by relying only upon increases in total factor productivity. And people actually, Korean people actually pay more attention on the way of attaining relatively higher factor productivity. This is the way to improve their quality of life. And so, but in answering your question, why the ruling party lost due to the relatively poorly performed economies, probably, let's say, the government or ruling party failed to communicate with people as regards the sources of relatively low growth. And I don't think there is any way, or there is no panacea for economic policies. So there is not an easy way to achieve relatively high growth. But if the people who are in charge of the policies were willing to communicate with the people by showing them what our current status was and what are the expected consequences or results of our policies, probably the understanding of the people regarding the economic circumstances might have improved. But that was not necessarily that was not the case, and so even if, as I said, basically I agree with the argument that the loss was due to the poor performances of the economy, and by agreeing with that, what I say is that much more focus should have been placed on economic issues rather than on political issues, and I guess that was one way to explain, to answer your question.
Due to time restraint, we are forced to conclude our special session with the President. Please give him another big round of applause.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it was my pleasure of meeting you, and I hope that what we have discussed today help you enhance your understanding of the Korean economy, and let's keep in touch.